right. Well, good evening, everyone. I hope you can all see and hear us. Rona promises me she will use her most booming New York voice this evening to speak with us. Rona, I'm thrilled that you can join us this evening. Thank you. And I'd also like to extend a very heartfelt thanks to Bella Kessian, our host this evening, and really thank you for the initiative that you took last year in starting these gatherings, these salons in the 19th century style. I can feel the spirits of Gertrude Stein and Peggy Guggenheim already hovering over us. But I'd also like to welcome all of you in a much more materially present form, the guests here tonight, among us artists, writers, curators, collectors, critics, and art historians, and particularly those of you who have actually written about Rona. And if I may mention Nancy Princenthal, who's with us tonight, who was one of the first to recognize Rona's practice, the impact of her practice, already in the 1990s, early 90s, and more recently, Dr. Chloe Julius, who is also here with us somewhere, there she is, who wrote about Rona's practice in her PhD dissertation. And I'd like to really, in that spirit of the salon, open up the conversation to all of us tonight. But before we did that, Rona, I thought we'd go through, present an overview of your 40-year practice now.
Oh, God.
Yeah. An extraordinary practice and artistic career with exhibitions around the globe, works in important collections, particularly in the US. There is a selection of some of the catalogs from Rona's many exhibitions on the table, so please do peruse them. And perhaps best to begin with the exhibition that brings you here to London, that opened the other day at Gallery Thaddaeus Ropac. An exhibition with 5 works really that I first discovered you through, and 4 of these works are in stainless steel. They are, there we go. They are quite monumental in scale, in scope, and conception, and they were executed over a 10-year period between 1998 and 2008. And one, the most recent tree piece, in 2022 in patinated black bronze, but conceived in 2011. And it's this piece, this monumental piece called Monkeys, that I remember you quoted in a review that Nancy wrote in 2002 when the piece was first shown at Sonnabend Gallery in New York, saying, "Never again. Never again will I go through this." And I wonder if you could tell us
Did I say that?
The genesis. I read it the other day, so yes,
Did you?
I can guarantee you did.
Thank God I don't have a good memory.
You could tell us about the genesis of this work and what led you to it.
So in '98, I decided I wanted to make a big material and imagistic change in my work. And I was working on Monkeys, which started where I was trying to make a Baroque movement. And it started where I took my arms and I had casts of my arms and they were all wired together. And I just had the arms trying to get their placement. I didn't know what was going to go into the arms at first. I had been trying to figure out, knowing that the body fragment had been in my work since the 80s, that I wanted a body fragment, but I didn't know how. And I was playing around with merging parts of me with different things. And when the animal combined with my human fragment, this light bulb went off. My God, the animal-human hybrid has been in our existence since the beginning of making. from the cave paintings to the first objects, and it's moved through every single period. And I thought, I want to make it contemporary. Can I? And monkeys, fox, there were 5 or 6 sculptures which were the first pieces where I merged these. Fox was the very first animal-human hybrid that was resolved. Monkeys took a long time, and that's probably why I said what I said. It spanned so many years. And it's the only piece that's an edition, where I never even finished the edition, because it takes a year and a half to cast one in the edition and make it.
And why stainless steel? What drew you to that particular material? It's not the easiest of materials to work with.
It's not. You know, I'm a believer that form and material are inseparable in sculpture. And if you get the right material married to the right image, it's like Bernini's Saint Teresa, where I look at that stone and I still can't believe it's pulsating. It feels like it's alive. It doesn't feel inert. It doesn't feel dead. It feels as if it could just walk away.
We actually have...
And to answer you about the stainless, it's quicksilver. It's in movement. It's in motion. It implies metamorphosis, something central to my work.
Exactly. And you mentioned Bernini already, St. Teresa, but I know it's this particular piece, Apollo and Daphne, that you encountered and thought about the possibility of change in something so permanent, and something so difficult to alter. And metamorphosis really has become a kind of leitmotif throughout your practice, throughout your work. What is it about this concept of change, of metamorphosis, that you find so appealing? Why do you find the need, the compulsion, as it were, to present metamorphosis to your viewers?
You know, as a kid, I fell in love with Kafka, and it became an obsession. I'm reading now the complete diary that's really supposedly as he really wrote it, not as it was then altered by Max Brod. And I love reading his, particularly Metamorphosis, where it's deadly serious, real, laugh out loud, absurd, all at the same time. It's about a capturing of life that I think will always be relevant, because it's about a raw emotion and reaction to life. And I think there are certain things as human beings that just don't change. We repeat the same thing over and over again. No matter how much historically we see, we repeat it. There are certain things about human behavior, animal behavior, that I'm just very interested in. And I think Kafka captures it so beautifully. And so that became something that's been central in my work since I've started making things.
You sent me a wonderful podcast not long ago of Ben Orki reading Kafka's rediscovered stories, and there's a phrase in there that Orki says, well, with Kafka, you're reading, and all of a sudden you realize in the normalcy of the day-to-day, there's the person talking is a half insect, or the bread loaf that's being cut has a pulse. And it's this uncanny turn, which I think in your work is particularly present in the stainless steel pieces, where suddenly the speed of the polished parts, the animal parts, stops and changes into the human, with a very sort of delicate, very refined surface, and you don't even realize it sometimes. And there's a wonderful drawing. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here, that was recently rediscovered, and it reminded me by Kafka, and reminded me very much of one of your earlier pieces. So, if I could just go back now to the earlier work. This wasn't always, stainless steel wasn't always your material of choice. It wasn't about the integral object. In fact, you were looking at you were creating a very different type of sculptural practice back in the 1980s.
So, I'm a material holic. I, at this point, think there's not a material left that I have not used in my work. And I believe, as much as I said earlier, that material impacts what we make, we are also impacted by when we study something, what's going on around us. And when I was in school, all my professors were minimalists. Now, those of you that are familiar with minimalism may not know, to be an artist at that time, if you worked figuratively, you were not an artist, you were a hack. Metaphor, symbolism didn't exist. Plus, in New York, people didn't want to look back historically. So if you were looking at something like at Bernini, what was wrong with you? Why are you looking at that? Is there something wrong with you? Seriously. The taboos were so monumental. And I thought I had to get out of New York. I grew up in New York, so what genius thing do I do? Let's go to Yale. Not realizing that I would not have freedom there. I thought I could go there, experiment, figure out who I am, what I'm interested in, and I start working and find myself realizing that metaphor is very important to me. And I started drawing from my body back then. Everyone thought I was out of my mind.
Who were some of the figures at Yale that you encountered?
Well, but oddly enough, so Richard Serra was a visiting professor, and he was incredibly supportive.
Of your shift to
he thought it
non-material?
He said it's raw. He was telling me it reminded him of Eva Hesse, which I heard a lot. And he said, ignore everyone. You've got this weird singular vision, just go for it. And he was very, very supportive. I got out of school. I did exactly the opposite of most of my peers. I started going to the Met and drawing, trying to understand why I was attracted to certain things and why I wasn't to other things. And I would just go on a daily basis and draw. And I started realizing Egyptian work. I started seeing the things that had tremendous significance to me. But then I also saw things like a boy's show at Dia and was knocked out by it and felt, oh my God, this is so incredibly strong. And when I got asked at a very early stage to do an installation, site-specific, at the Sculpture Center in the 80s, I had been fooling around with the bed image, and I was doing it by stacking and repetition, and I knew it came right out of boys. But what was interesting is everyone writing about it at the time was talking about it only in terms of minimalism, because boys and arte povera were just not known at all. And so it was interesting for me because I kept saying, I'm interested in that, but I'm really more interested in povera and boys, because the work goes in a different direction. And it's interesting to me that still people don't, when they talk about minimalism and arte povera and boys, don't talk about the differences, because there are differences.
You mentioned that when you created the bed pieces, you felt apprehensive that they were about a subject, they were about a bed. You feel less apprehensive about some of the elements in these bed pieces, which are scatological, which are clumps of bronze that appear as fecal clumps, particularly in lead bed of 87, 88.
Yeah.
And how did that dichotomy play out? How did you come to accept
it's an interesting thing. So when I was at Yale, I was working, and Robert Herbert, this wonderful art historian, walks into my studio and said, "You know, it looks like your studio is full of scatology here." And I didn't know what it meant, and I went home and I looked it up, and I thought, oh God, he's not saying what I think he's saying. And I remember calling my husband, who's a painter, Robert Feintuck, and said, "Am I out of my mind?" He didn't say anything. And when I'm making these bed pieces, and I have someone to the studio, they said, "You know, these are really powerful, but it looks like your studio's full of shit." And I thought, dear God, I've heard this before. Now, yes, I came to terms with the work being scatological, but I was more uncomfortable with the fact that they look like beds, because it was such a taboo to move in a direction like that artistically. And, I was thinking about the bed. It's a place where you're born, it's where you have sex, it's where you live out your fantasies, it's where you die, it's where you're sick, it's where you dream. I love that. I thought, my God, this is such a powerful place, an image. And so that door opening and finally accepting that, and then trying to find other objects that had similar metaphoric or symbolic meaning, collecting shoes, throwing them in the middle of my studio and saying, what does shoes make me think of? What do they represent? Or baby bottles or teeth, and it was like, oh my God, I have to make everything and try everything. And if I look back now, because I looked when you were putting all these images together, I thought, my God, in a decade I went through so much. Why? Was it my age, or it was just like I was on fire because all of a sudden imagery was possible, meaning was possible? Meaning, oh my God, that's...
You mentioned in an interview at some point that what really helped you with these early pieces was looking at Rauschenberg's bed at MoMA. It sort of created a point of validation for what you were doing. But considering how long it takes you to create a series of works in stainless steel, or more recently in acrylic and resin, you mentioned you went through 4 or 5 years of gestation of getting the material into your hands, working it up, and then producing a body of work. Was that the case also in the earlier pieces? Did you go through these phases of experimentation,
No.
disappearing into the studio, and no?
I think with my hands. So when I recently was going through storage during COVID, I was checking how older pieces were, and one piece needed a little loving care, and I found another sculpture inside of it. Literally. My things, when they get x-rayed, people are going to find odd things in them. I start in one direction and it goes in another direction. I honestly sometimes think it takes me 10 years to figure out why I made something. I'm the last person to understand why I made something, or really what's there. There are times Robert will say something to me like, "Don't you see this?" And I'm like, no, I don't. And now I do. 10 years later, 15 years later, I do. I'm a very unconscious maker.
We'll come back to the diversity of interpretations and how your work, a bit like the Joseph Beuys that we saw, the Brazilian Fonts, was said to absorb their viewers' energies and create a kind of muted experience of seeing the work. But your work also magnetizes various forms of interpretation, be they psychological, feminist, political, formal, etc. There is a moment, though, and I don't know when that moment exactly is. I don't know if it can be pinpointed. That's the job of art historians, I suppose, where the materials in your work, they move from kind of a found quality to something that's integral to your own making. And in particular, I think it happens with the teeth pieces in the 90s, where you move from chattering teeth to teeth that are much more real, palpable.
Except those are rubber rotting Halloween teeth.
Even better. Was there a moment, and what stood behind this? Was it practical simply?
You know, with sculpture, sometimes I think the pragmatic comes first. And you go, okay, so I can't do this, I'm going to do it this way. And what happened was these rubber rotting Halloween teeth that I was in love with stopped being made because they were unpopular. I seemed to be the only one interested. So I called the company and I said, well, can I order a large quantity? And they said, 30,000. It's a little deep for me. So I thought, okay, I'll start making molds of my own teeth. So then I literally enter my work. And that's how I sort of slowly backslide into getting more and more of me into my work. And even this piece has a very odd way of coming into being. A friend of mine said to me, we're going to the Philadelphia Museum. I want to see a Renoir bather show. And I'm like, ooh, I hate those paintings. They put my teeth on edge. I find them vile. And he said, oh, come on, humor me. Come and see the show. And I walked out and I thought, God, I want to do a piece that embodies how I feel about these paintings. And this is where Little Bathers came from.
Is this also where the color pink comes from?
Yep.
I had no idea. Renoir.
Renoir
as a source of inspiration. I've included various slides of art historical comparison for us to ponder, but I had not included Renoir. It never dawned on me to think about Renoir in terms of Little Bathers, this really extraordinary piece that owes a lot on the one hand to minimalism, I think, and to the idea of the repeated object. And then on the other, of course, to this psychological level of interpretation. But what also is interesting is that the little pieces, the fragments, they become entities in themselves. They're no longer fragments that you might pick up from other sources, but they are independent entities. And this is something that I think you've been drawn to, the idea of the fragment as an entity, as something that has its own life. In the artist project, you mentioned that Egyptian sculptural fragments at the Met that you were drawn to and talked about, they seem to you as having had been made that way originally. And I think some of that seems to translate particularly into these teeth pieces. And Dirthead, this seminal work, seminal is also quite a loaded term, I suppose, in this context, came about in this framework of thinking about fragments and entities, and then letting the work do its own role of interpretation. Why 400 pounds of earth and 400
10 tons.
Sorry, 10 tons of earth and 400 little
heads.
earthen heads.
Well, so imagine I'm making these teeth pieces, and they've been pink, they've scattered, they have been in different colors, and they also were in bowls like fruit. And how they're out in the world, I think, affects their meaning. And I wanted to see what would happen if I took the teeth that had such a different feeling in bubblegum pink and then made it out of a material that combined it with earth. Would it read differently? And I got asked to do a new piece for the Johannesburg Biennale.
Mm-hmm.
And the gallery at the time was smart and said to me, "It's going to get all stolen. Make it so it falls apart so we don't need to worry about it." So I thought, oh, okay. I'll take 10 tons of earth. I'll make the 400 orbs, because I'm insane. I make these all by hand by myself. And if they get stolen, they'll fall apart. But oddly enough, they never did. So I loved when it was installed in Johannesburg,
Mm-hmm.
because the crew was wonderful. They had no problem putting out the 10 tons of earth. But these individual forms with the teeth, they wouldn't touch them. They thought it had powers where, I'm not joking, I could get someone to run to the other side of the building if I went near them with it. So I had to install that by myself, but the mound they helped me with. And then this piece traveled a lot to a lot of other institutions. So this is at the Groninger Museum in the Netherlands. And there it got talked about completely differently. And then it travels again.
Here it was, I think the news coverage of it was relating it to imagery of massacres in Rwanda, Cambodia at the time.
Right.
This was in the late 90s. And then it was in Salzburg.
Then it goes to Salzburg, and it's the Holocaust. Then it goes to the Lyon Biennale, and it's the beginning of a genetics section. And it kept traveling and getting all these different interpretations depending upon where it was in the world and what was going on. Then in Wolfsburg, they do a big show about the mouth. And the show opens during COVID. So everyone's there with masks, and there are all these pieces with teeth and mouths, which has this mind-boggling twist to it. So for me, it's really fascinating to see how the work gets interpreted, depending on where it is.
Yeah. And it's interesting that in that catalog, the curator, Uta Rukam, mentioned this is really a modern vanitas of degradation, of things decaying. There's also another side of it, which I see as a kind of sense of preservation, because teeth are used for forensic DNA analysis. So in a way, it is preserving identity, and it's preserving your identity, isn't it? 400 times. Endlessly. And it's something which I feel has this idea of preservation, of self-preservation, gain momentum in your practice over time. And if I may say, as time progresses, there's a sense of that desire to preserve identity, to preserve a legacy. If we can incorporate trees, because the teeth entities, the little heads, they also make an appearance, but they make an appearance in the form of sort of these fallen fruit, juxtaposed with the tree pieces that you started making about 20 years ago. Indeed, very potent imagery historically. I love this Hugo van der Hoos painting, which could be an index of Rona Pondick metamorphosis, creatures, and imagery. But then pedantry appears. So no longer the dispersed elements, the little heads, but your head appears floating on this, in this tracery, arboreal tracery. And here it's installed at the Sonsbeek Foundation, Sculptural Foundation in the Netherlands. How did this imagery come about?
The head and tree.
Head and tree. Yeah.
So I was working on that animal-human hybrid pieces, and I had been doing tree sculptures. And just to tell you, in terms of the tree sculptures, I had a very fortunate experience where these collectors, who were known for giving a lot of artists their first outdoor experience and commissioned, and they approached me, and all of my work at that point were in more ephemeral materials, all indoors. And they said, would you like to do an outdoor sculpture? And I said, I would, but I don't know if it makes sense. And I said, well, if you give me lots of time to kind of live with this, maybe it will make sense at one point. And I was wandering their property, and they had an apple orchard. And I said, interesting. Nature, nature, nature. You put a big sculpture outdoors, doesn't look right. It's the wrong scale. Indoors, it looks right. A tree, no matter what size it is, looks like it's the right scale because it's in nature. Nature made it. And so we accept whatever size it is. Same thing with animals outdoors. You could see a cat, and it could be walking, and it could be 1,000 feet away from you. Its scale doesn't look wrong. It looks right, because we know it, and we accept it. So I thought, why fight it? I'm going to take nature and put it back in nature as a sculpture. But I'm going to put something perplexing that you're going to find under it. Apples with teeth. So my teeth from indoors made it outdoors. And as my hybrid pieces are developing, I had a horrible experience, and I wound up almost paralyzed, and I had 19 hours of neurosurgery. And when I came to, I was incredibly drugged, and I was hallucinating. And I had this recurring image of my head leaving my body, floating up into the clouds, bouncing from treetop to treetop, and my head just settled in the canopy of a tree. And it was the most comforting feeling. And the whole time I was in the hospital, and the whole time, because it was a long time for me to learn how to walk and use my hands all over again, I had to make this piece. And I remember as I was working on it, and also going through the period where I had to have an assistant work with me, and I had to start explaining to someone how I made things, which was the most frustrating thing in the world. I was just like, I remember each day I was like, oh my God, I'm gonna cut my head off out of frustration, because I cannot figure out how to tell someone what I would just make, because it was so difficult. And I remember Robert turned to me and he said, do you realize that the tree trunk looks like your spine? And I didn't see it at first. And this piece has so many metaphoric readings for me that are hard for me to even talk about, because that experience was just difficult, but also transformed me in such an incredible way, where making changed, thinking about my work changed, time changed. I began to not care about how long it took to make something. I don't care if it takes 10 years, 12 years, 15 years, or 2 years. Because the idea of letting something evolve to find its own meaning and feeling right, how do you control that?
And in a way, your practice of making the object, it seems to me, changed because the trees and the tree sculptures that followed Head and Tree were not replicas of trees that existed in nature per se. They were composites or consolidations of nature that you very painstakingly put back together. So this level of artifice that the artist brings to nature comes back fully in these works. So these really are trees of your imagination.
So these are all fictions. They're not actual trees. I collected bins and bins of tree types because I just wanted the texture. Either to take a mold off of it and make a silicone stamp so I didn't have to put texture in over 10 or 15 feet of surface area, or like an erector set, not in this one because this one's almost all modeled, but in these, or in like Head and Tree, these are just taking parts of trees or branches and turning them into like erector sets. So where I dowel, pin, take wax, model the transitions between them, or areas where I have to remake it in metal because some of these are direct burnouts and they don't cast. And then you don't have an original. So I have to go back and put it in metal. So taking welding rods and turning a welding rod into a branch because parts just didn't cast. So there are so many different issues in terms of making that I had to deal with in making the trees. I eventually got to the point where I was like, I can't do this anymore. It's too insanely stressful. Is 40%, 50%, 60% going to cast? So I started modeling a lot more of the sections and making molds so that if I didn't cast, we could just run it through and cast it again. Mm-hmm. So there are just so many different modes of making that go on that it's almost impossible to talk about all of them.
But your frustration, if we can call it that,
yeah,
with the lack of knowledge in making and the lack of attention, now I'm speaking more broadly, in art schools and in art education, particularly with sculpture, of making, of fabrication, that frustration translated into an exhibition.
Yes.
In 2000, well, actually in the early 2000s, you were already thinking about this with the stainless steel pieces as they were emerging. But in 2009, at the Worcester Museum, you, with the curators, went through the collection. And what happened there?
It sort of started from a different place. This show is called The Metamorphosis of an Object, but it started where I was going to call it In the Making. And the reason was utter frustration because friends, curators, they'd be in my studio and they'd start talking to me and I'd be talking about modeling and carving and I would get these blank stares. And I realized they don't know what I'm talking about. And I said, you ever hear of Giacometti or Brancusi? And I would still get these blank stares. And I said, you take clay and you add it and you move it around and you model it. Or with Brancusi, there's subtraction of material and it's carving. And there's a different way of thinking if you're working in a subtractive rather than in an additive way of making. And I realized they had no idea what I was talking about. None.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, is this going to seem didactic and preachy if I make an exhibition about making? And I was talking to a curator, and I thought, I've got to do this not at a big museum because they're going to be too territorial, because I wanted to cross cultures, different time periods, and use subjects like how gesture and posture makes meaning, how hair translates in sculpture, and how repetition makes meaning. And forget about didactics and try to just make it about the visual, looking at the different ways different things are made, and put them next to each other and see if there's a logic to it,
Mm-hmm.
and if it could speak on its own. I remember at the time that this exhibition came together, a lot of friends that were curators would say, well, what's the point of the exhibition? I don't get it. And I said, there is no point. It's just about looking at what's in front of you and responding to it. And we got into these very philosophical conversations that were very interesting. I feel like a klutz in that exhibition, quite honestly, because I look at how masterful and how in different periods of time there's so much, and I don't want to say skill, but there's just a way of translating a material or understanding a material that's so different. And I don't exactly know why it is or how it is or how a specific thing gets a certain meaning, why hair in India or Asia or Africa or, in different parts of Europe translate so differently at different times in different materials. To me, that's fascinating.
And your material experimentation, just to bring us now to the present day, and actually to work which is not in the exhibition here, but you're currently engaged in creating. You've moved into another level of material exploration, to acrylic and resin, and I found it very interesting that coming back to the notion of permanence and wanting to continue your legacy, you test these materials, you test the very matter that you use in a scientific way.
So I have a number of conservators that I started working very closely with, and when I started playing around with acrylic and resin and the epoxy, I just had a little concern about how they were going to hold up over time. I know stainless, bronze, glass, stone, I know all those. We've been around and we've seen, and time has tested them. These are more new. And so my conservator said, oh, at the Museum of Natural History, they have technology where they can show us in a few 100 years from now what these materials will look like. So I gave her the materials and we ran them through, and they said, okay, we know in 200 or 300 years these are not going to change. Beyond that, we can't push it anymore because we don't know and it's basically exposing it to UV, which is what destroys a lot of materials. And so they said, we know you're good for a few hundred years. So I thought, okay, that's pretty good.
You're happy with that?
Yeah, I'm content with
years.
that.
Yeah. In these more recent works, your head, which is always your head at age 46, when you did the original cast.
Yes. So
Yeah.
you should say every single sculpture. So Fox is the very first animal-human hybrid where my head appears with my hair. And when I did that life cast, I have to tell you, I was so happy I had a pad and a pencil, because I had two very close friends that I trusted to do medical silicone on my head. And because I'm crazy, I didn't use straws in case there was a bubble, because I could have suffocated. But I had a choking reflex where I was really having problems breathing and swallowing. And I started writing, "Cut, I can't breathe." So they sliced up my neck, thank God. And then about 2 hours into it, I was writing, "Get this fucking thing off of me," because you get sensory deprivation. It was awful. And I remember thinking, this head is going to be like gold. I'm not doing this again. And I didn't. Every single sculpture I have made, if you go to the exhibition at Thaddaeus's, every single one of those pieces, every head comes from that one life cast of fox. And it's the fox is in the exhibition. And in monkeys, my head is reduced in scale. And that's where I started using computer technology just for scaling purposes, no other reason. And my head just keeps moving through my work. In these pieces, what I got so excited about with the color, at the beginning, in my normal obsessive way, for the first year, I must have cast my head 100 different times in different colors, different translucencies, opacities, trying to see what happened with how you saw the head. And what I got very, very interested in was, one, using these colors that you could taste it. And I thought, oh my God, synesthesia is occurring. The color is crossing from your visual to taste. And something I haven't said is, as much as I am a material holic, I'm also someone who wants my viewer, from the very beginning through every single thing I've ever made, I want my viewer to feel my work viscerally in your body. And that idea that the color then was crossing your senses, I was just like elated.
And it's the color that really does address the viewer directly, because the image, the form, is quite difficult to get at. I feel that it's distant. You're behind this foggy glass, and it's an incredible experience seeing these encased heads, because they do forbid a kind of sculptural experience in the three-dimensional sense. You're moving from plane to plane to plane, and every time you move, it's distorting the image. So you have almost, you have 5 essentially paintings, as it were. You're sort of cutting into that medium of painting and using the color to get across this emotive impact, whatever it may be, whatever association we have with yellow or blue. And then the more recent, or one body of work that came out of it, smaller figures that even in the context of the pandemic have been related to bacterial forms, viral forms multiplying, and include as well heads where you've started. Is this the first instance of manipulating the proportions of the head?
Oh, in that, yeah. The head has moved down in scale, and then I went bigger, and I also not just changed the scale of the head. There are times where I pull it by modeling it, and I'm curious to see how it changes, what you feel looking at a head when it becomes this big and it's sitting on the ground and it's not facing you like this. And something else that is important for me is, and it took me a while to see this, I love the fact that my eyes are closed. I'm not looking at my viewer. I'm allowing my viewer to look at me without being self-conscious. And I think something happens when the viewer's not self-conscious, where you relate differently to an object. And I'm very internal in these. And I like that separation. Maybe I'm more comfortable that way, I'm not sure, psychologically. But I think it sets a stage that's different for the viewer.
Whatever the case may be for you, there is a perpetual sense of experimentation. And you once said to me, which I think relates quite nicely to these early teeth pieces, that you go to the studio every day the way one brushes one's teeth, or one should, I suppose, brush one's teeth every day, because you don't want your teeth to fall out.
Mm-hmm.
And there is constant need to repeat, and perhaps in the multiplicity of forms, some of that is evident. But at this stage, I'd like to really open up to our audience and wonder if there are any questions, any comments, feelings, emotions that you'd wish to share about Rona's work, or have questions for Rona. Yes.
May I ask, can you tell us more about why Bernini in particular? There are, of course, many Italian artists who wrote part of the history of art. Why Bernini?
You know, I don't even remember what age I was when I first went to the Borghese. And I was standing in front of Apollo and Daphne. And my mouth was just hanging open. And this loud American walked in shorts and said, "Holy shit." And I turned to my husband and I said, "I want to make work that gets a comment like that." And I stood there watching him and individual after individual walk into the space and watch their response to the work. I've never seen anything like that. It's an amazing thing, I think, when you engage a viewer like that. If I can engage a viewer like that, I can die tomorrow.
Any other comments, questions? Yes.
I apologize if this is a little far-fetched, but you mentioned earlier that Kafka was a reference point, right? I think another artist who clearly Kafka is a reference point too would be David Cronenberg.
Sure.
Dealing with the body and kind of the grotesqueness of certain, like obviously most famously in The Fly, but I think more obviously in the film Dead Ringers.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned having this kind of life-changing medical event. Do you think about your relationship between stainless steel and other kind of industrial materials with their relationship with medical materials? And then also maybe that kind of outside more traditional art materials such as marble or things like that, and kind of also the undercurrent of minimalism with
Mm-hmm.
stainless steel as well.
You know, when I started working with the stainless steel, it wasn't because of medical reasons. It was really because it looks like quicksilver. And I love the fact that it looks like mercury. It looks like it's moving in front of you. It looks like it's dissolving. There aren't that many materials on their own that have a property like that. And I'm interested in contradiction. I'm interested in how something could look grotesque and beautiful simultaneously. Off-putting and compellingly alluring. Do you ever think about your relationships with people you're close with? You love them, you hate them, you want to kill them, you want to have sex with them. How's that possible? I want that in my work.
I hope someone wrote that down. That was a great quote. We're recording.
Yes.
Question about, so when looking at your works, there's something quite playful about them, but there's also something quite
I love that.
unsettling about them. And I just wanted to know if you do you even mind which way people go,
No.
playful, unsettling, and also have there been any reactions to your work that surprised you as well, aside from someone saying "holy shit" when they see it?
I had a collector once say to me, "Your work is like my experience with oysters." I hated it, and once I got a palate for it, I couldn't get enough of it, which I loved.
That's good.
I was saying to Albert earlier that there are times I'm laughing hysterically at something I've done, and then someone walks over and finds it so unsettling. And I'm like, huh. But then someone else walks over and starts laughing. And I see this happen a lot with my work. And I'm not surprised because I think something I discovered really early, you cannot control your viewer. It's impossible. As much as I'd like to, because I'm a control freak, it's just not possible. And I realized, why not set a stage so rich where it unfolds that every time you come to it, you may see something you didn't see before. Or one person finds it one way and another person finds it the complete opposite. And it's partially because we all bring who we are to what we're looking at. We can't, how could we control that? You know?
Thank you.
I have a question. So it's wonderful, that precise description. You talk about the problem of interpretation and how the viewer interprets the work. Does that inform the future of the work? I'm particularly thinking about the teeth when you showed it in the biennial. Was it in Turkey? I can't remember.
In Johannesburg.
In Johannesburg, and it was so powerful. It talked about, the Rwanda and all that. And you had started that project out of Halloween, this sort of very day-to-day life object that you would see, in New York and the United States. And that had multiple interpretations, very deep. Do you think that would inform the future of how that work would be presented, or if you would change, the iconography of the work into something different?
Something that I have seen, and my husband and I love seeing shows, and we were supposed to go to Berlin to just see a painting show after being here. We love seeing work, and for me, and I will tell you, this is interesting, there's a Donatello show right now. I thought I knew Donatello, but I had only seen a piece here, piece in another setting. I had never seen a show where there was so much work together, and I felt like I had seen it for the first time in a completely different light. Curators have huge impact on how we think and see an artist's work or artists. And as I've grown, I've become aware of the fact that you think you know an artist, but you may not. The context changes, or you change. I don't know if you've ever experienced that you saw something when you were younger, you couldn't understand it, then you're older and you're like, oh my God, I love this. How could I not understand it? Or the flip, the reverse happens. Things are always changing.
They are indeed. I think Khalid is waiting anxiously for us. And so perhaps at this stage, if you would like to continue the conversation in a more convivial and culinary environment, all that really remains to be said is, Rona, thank you so much for opening this world to us.